Welcome back again. We're picking up where we just left off. We just finished an episode on Psalms chapter 13. We're going to jump right into chapter 14, but first I wanted to pause for a minute. From the last episode, I changed my shirt, and I wanted to just talk about this for just a second and bring awareness to this situation. Our youth pastor is my pastor's son, Bradley Nave is his son. And they have a 1-year-old boy named Easton, and this is for him. It says Super Kid, Team Easton. Right now he's at St. Jude in Memphis. He was diagnosed with retinoblastoma, with large tumors in both of his eyes. And they're down there going through their second round of treatments. And it's a really tough process. We've gotten good news recently with his treatment and shrinkage in the tumors. But I just can't imagine what it's been like to go through that as a parent. I can't imagine watching your child have to endure that. And obviously something as precious as your vision and the vision of your child. It's been weighing on the church a lot. It's been weighing on us and on their family a lot, and we love them so much. We're just asking for prayers and just to keep them in your mind, and anybody watching this, any prayers are really appreciated. So yeah, Team Easton. His name is Easton. His name is Easton Nave, and he's a champ. So
we love you, Easton.
Yep, we do. All right. Well, on that note, let's move on. Let's jump right into Psalms chapter 14, which you were very excited to dive into before we got started tonight. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say.
Love Psalms 14. One thing that you'll notice in Psalms chapter 14 is that there are odd number of verses. So this actually seemingly contradict my couplet theory.
It does. You're wrong.
But it actually doesn't, and I'll tell you why once we get there. All right.
Okay.
So the first verse, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, they have done abominable works, there is none that doeth good. Okay, so there's two statements here. All right, so the first verse functions as the first couplet. First couplet is the first statement, second couplet is the second statement. All right. So if you practice what we talked about in the last chapter, the fool hath said in his heart, open quotes, there is no God, close quotes. So the question asks, quote what the fool hath said in his heart, all you would say is, there is no God. All right? So, Philip, whenever you think of the phrase, the fool, what do you think of, like, in terms of, like, what comes to mind?
I think of a foolish man. I think of a singular one person that is a fool, which is why this verse confuses me dramatically.
Okay. All right. So you're getting tripped up with the they, right? The they are corrupt.
Yes. Oh, well, I mean, I understand that he's speaking of the foolish, correct?
Right. Yeah. The group of the foolish. Yeah.
Right, but it's just grammatic. It just doesn't
because it's a singular noun and then a plural pronoun. Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Okay. But like in terms of like just like even going like smaller than that, what do you think of like whenever you think of the word fool? Like what's some synonyms for the word fool?
Dumb.
Dumb. Okay.
Okay. The synonyms for the word fool. Unwise.
Okay.
Let me think. A hasty choice maker, someone that doesn't have patience, someone that doesn't use wisdom, someone that doesn't seek counsel,
okay.
someone that's I don't know. I mean, like, no. I can think of some people. Do you want me to give you examples?
No.
No, just kidding.
So like with a Philip Melder version of this verse read, the dumb idiot said in his heart, there is no God.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, that version would be wrong. Okay.
Oh, okay.
No, just wait. Okay. Okay. So the Hebrew here word for fool does not actually like mean someone who's dumb or someone who is not smart. Okay, so what the Hebrew mind has in thought is this idea of someone who is morally deficient. Whenever they think of the word or the phrase "the fool," in this case, the Amplified version renders it as like someone who is not spiritually wise. I don't like that so much because I feel like you could be morally wise and not be spiritually wise. But I like the NIV version whenever it says someone who is morally deficient. Has said in his heart there is no God. Which I'm not saying that whenever you see the word fool in every single case of the Psalms, that all of that means morally deficient or someone who is not morally sound. But in this case, David is meaning someone who is not a moral person, saying in his heart, there is no God.
What do you think about 5 verse 5 when it speaks of the foolish?
The foolish had the foolish. What is
foolish
that?
Shall not stand in thy sight. Thou hatest all workers of iniquity.
Um,
I'm putting you on the spot. Sorry.
I would need to like research that more. I feel like we probably should have addressed that whenever we did chapter 5. But I think that's still not talking about someone who is dumb or
right.
like.
I agree. I can see. I agree. Even when you say someone's a stupid idiot, sometimes you don't mean that they're dumb.
Right.
That's mean that they make poor choices.
Right.
But so, the morally deficient, that's really interesting. With the fool being morally deficient, it makes a lot more sense with the second statement in verse 1, right? Because you wouldn't say if someone's just like a dummy that they are corrupt. But if you say someone's morally deficient, they are corrupt, they have done abominable works, there's none that do with good. That makes a lot more sense.
Right. And here's my question that I think it's on our burden to ask is what makes us, as someone who does believe in God, morally better than an atheist? Like, why does our belief in God make us morally better? Or morally less deficient, I should say.
Morally less deficient
than an atheist.
Huh. What would you say?
I would say that if you want to talk about morals, you have to have a center that is morally perfect to adjust your morals to. And I think that's kind of what, I mean, this is a deep philosophical question.
Right.
But basically, what David here is saying is that the atheist has no moral compass. They have no center of morality to base their entire lives off of. But on the contrary, and it's not stated here explicitly, but he says someone who does believe in God does have at least some type of moral compass to adhere their life to and to reflect and to try to emulate their life. Now, we'll see later on in the psalm where that's not the case, but they at least have a example, a reflection, an image to go off of that they can actually direct their lives back to. And I love to hear that David is not calling. I'm glad that David does not give the English 21st century definition of the word fool here. Because I know a lot of atheists, I have a lot of atheist friends that are very intelligent, very smart, and maybe even have like a moral code. David's not saying here that the atheist does not have any moral code. Mm-hmm. What he's saying here is that they are morally deficient in their nature because they have no moral center, which is God alone.
Right.
Then he gives that plural pronoun, they, referring back to the fool, or the foolish, you could say, are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none that doeth good. So none of the fools do anything good. Why is that? Because they are morally deficient, because they do not have a moral compass, being God himself. And because of that, that is the premise, or that is the reason behind why they are corrupt, morally deficient. That's another synonym for the word corrupt. But then I love how David does not just be like, yeah, those atheists over there, they're stupid or they're morally corrupt. He then looks back at the entire world in verse number 2, and he says, the Lord looked down from heaven upon the children of men. That's all of us. Mm-hmm. No one's excluded from that group to see if there were any that did understand and seek God. So here we get this word understand again. Okay, so you have like the type of knowledge vocabulary coming up here. The fool, as someone who we would think as lacking all knowledge or lacking all understanding, and then the word understand in verse 2. So he's keying off of words that we normally would ascribe to just like knowing things or memorizing things and being good, but he's having a deeper level of what knowledge is, of what understanding is in these two verses. Understanding is not merely just knowing something and regurgitating it. David has a deeper understanding of what understanding is, and that is that you actually act upon some type of moral knowledge from God himself in the world that we live in. And he said that there's none that actually understands. They are all gone aside. They are altogether become filthy. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. So the same description that he gives the atheist, the fool, the moral atheist, and the morally deficient atheist in verse number 1, he gives the same description to all of mankind in verse number 3. So why is that? Why do you think that? Why not just start off with all of creation is morally deficient? Why start off with the atheist and then go into all of creation? Or all of humanity, rather.
To show that all of humanity is morally deficient?
But he could have just said, he could have just like kicked out verse 1.
Right.
That, verse 2, and it worked the same way, right?
Right. I don't know.
So I think, and this is Eric Forbes talking. This is not, any scholar saying this. I think what he's saying, he's making a distinction that someone who believes in God, and especially in the 21st century church, and after Christ died for us, and you have grace in the New Testament, that our moral compass, our moral profoundness, our righteousness of what the Bible calls it, our righteousness comes from God alone. So if we seek out righteousness in humanity, we're no different than the atheist. We're no different than the fool. If we seek out righteousness in a sense of, okay, how can I, as a human, achieve a certain moral standard? We will never, ever attain to that moral standard, ever. But if we seek out a moral standard on God alone, then we actually come into the righteousness that is not of ourselves, but it is solely of God. And, of course, in the New Testament, of Christ's sacrifice and blood and his cross. And so he's not saying here that we will never, ever attain to righteousness, because thank God we have in the new covenant. But what he's saying here is that by ourselves, all of our righteousness are as filthy rags, as Isaiah says. We are altogether become filthy. There's nothing with good, no, not one. We have a moral sin problem that is inherent to our nature. Just as the nature of the atheist is sin, so is the nature of humanity all of sin. The only difference between the atheist and the Christian is a belief in God. And obviously that's the obvious answer. But what does that belief in God actually do for you? That gives you a righteousness, a sense of moral compass that the atheist does not have, not by a self-fulfilling righteousness, but by a righteousness that is imputed or come from God alone, and to fill our broken humanity and to make our humanity whole.
Is there anything to say about it reminding me of the days of Noah? That the Lord looked down to see if there were any that did understand and seek God?
Yeah. That whole entire imagery, I feel like, is all throughout the Bible. Like the Lord looking down upon the children. Yeah, definitely. I mean, and that's the thing. It's like I think our interpretation of the atheist, in Psalms 14, I think is much more detailed than what David is thinking of the atheist. David here is saying that someone who does not fully trust in God, I think, is saying by their actions, there is no God. I can be a morally deficient person and be an atheist myself, even if I am a professing Christian, if my actions do not prove that there is a God, and if I seek out my righteousness by my actions, by my words, by whatever I do, if I'm looking to fulfill my life and my righteousness in myself, I am by nature acting as the atheist in Psalms chapter 14, verse 1. So I think David here is commissioning all of humanity not to rely on themselves at all, but to actually give their brokenness, their filthiness, their corrupt nature back to God, who can actually do something with a broken humanity through the perfect human, and that is Jesus Christ.
Wow. I did not see it that way. you enlightened me once again. That was really good. Yeah, so yeah. Okay, so then where do we go from there?
That's two on. And then he goes, I mean, here again, we have the word knowledge in verse number 4. So he's still picking up this type of like word imagery of understanding, full knowledge. Have all the workers of iniquity no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread and call not upon the Lord. Okay, so this functions as a couplet in itself. The first question being the first couplet, and then the statement being the second couplet. Okay, so the workers of iniquity, that who in the first word of the second statement, of the first statement in this verse, goes back to all workers of iniquity.
Right.
All right.
So all the workers of iniquity eat up my people. How? As they eat bread.
Okay, so who do you think? I'm sorry.
Who do I think calls not upon the Lord?
Well, that's a you could ask that question.
I mean, I would say it's a further description of the workers of iniquity, right?
Right. You're right. Who do you think the my is referring to though in my people? Read up my people.
Well, it's either David or the Lord.
Yes.
So there's not really any other options. It would make more sense in my head if it was the Lord's people.
Why are you saying that?
Just because that just seems like something that the Lord would say, that the workers going to eat up my people, but it could also be David. I don't know.
Right. I mean, it seems like all the translations are like standard that it's David's people. Because like in other translations, you'll have a capital pronoun for every to the Lord, and there is no capital pronoun in any other version.
But I feel like I've seen other pronouns that were referring to the Lord that aren't capitalized in Psalms, but maybe I'm wrong.
I think like the Amplified version is pretty good about like capitalizing pronouns that refer back to the Lord. Let me check. It's a good point. I'm gonna pull up Psalm 14 in the NIV and see what it says.
Okay. Scripture dive.
Okay, the NIV does not capitalize pronouns or refer back to the Lord. The Amplified version does. So, like in verse number 7, when the Lord restores his captive people, the his is capitalized, like the H on the his. Back to verse number 4, the M on my is not capitalized. So I'm guessing that they're assuming that that's David talking.
Which it is David, because there's only a few times where David is like basically quoting something that the Lord said, which this doesn't seem to be one of those times.
Because he addresses the Lord in the third person and later on in the verse. It wouldn't make sense that the Lord addresses himself, which he does in the third person, but like I don't think that's the case here.
Right.
We get those like in Isaiah, I am, or thus saith the Lord, referring to him, like he's talking to himself in the third person when he says, thus saith the Lord. I don't think that's what's happening here, though. I think this is David talking, and the workers of iniquity are eating up his people and his kingdom as they eat bread. So that's a what? Comparison, right? So just as often or just as easily as they eat bread, all these workers of iniquity are eating up my people, and they call out upon the Lord, right?
Right.
So here's my question. In the Psalms, do you think that the same group of people are described in like different like clauses, nouns, adjectives?
Maybe.
Actually, because like my thing is like in Psalms chapter 18, we had a point at our last tournament, and it was the difference between a people whom I have not known and the strangers.
Right.
Because like conceptually, they're like one and the same.
Right.
But like for Bible quizzing purposes, I feel like those are two different groups. like the people whom I have not known, and then the strangers.
I believe I actually asked Brother Faubert that question, and I believe that for quizzing purposes, they will be, because someone can be, you cannot know someone, but that doesn't mean that they're a stranger.
Right, right. And my thing is like if you start making that like one and the same, you start making like evildoers and the workers of iniquity, those are now the same.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's a slippery slope. Like if
Right.
you allow it there, it has to be allowed here, and then so like obviously I think what David has in mind is the fool, like the foolish or the workers of iniquity in verse number 4. Now, if I had a question that said, um, who called upon the Lord, and you said the fool, I count that incorrect for
Right.
Bible quizzes.
Right.
But I think conceptually, David is having this image of these morally corrupt people. But even you could even extend that to all the children of men being workers of iniquity.
True.
Because basically, what he's actually fighting, he's fighting a morally corrupt problem. People who have not given themselves over to the will of God, because if they had, they wouldn't be fighting against David in the first place. So he's fighting against a morally corrupt people who are against the will of God, now eating up his own kingdom, his people, and they don't address the Lord in any way in their own personal lives at all. And so David here is not only he's by in the psalm he's not only saying I'm fighting against people who don't even believe in God. I'm fighting against people who say they believe in God, but they actually do not by their own actions. Their actions actually deceive them, according to verse number 4. And here we go. It's he's talking about these same people in verse number 5. There were they in great fear, for God is in the generation of the righteous.
My daughter struggled with this verse. I've got this verse down. This was just one of those ones where she just for some reason that verse beginning didn't stick in her head, and I have the song playing in my head right now. So just want to thank the people that do the songs for the kids, because those things are so effective. They really are. They're fantastic, and they're great for me too. I can every verse we talk about, a song plays through my head.
This is awesome. So God is in the generation of the righteous. And so this whole idea of like foolish and righteous, that's two contrasting nouns or adjectives rather, foolish and righteous. So he stops talking about this morally deficient group of people who are essentially just all humanity without God. And he now goes into God is in the generation of the righteous. So the righteous here is now contrasted to the fool because why? God is in them. That's the only reason why they are righteous, is because God himself dwells among them. So because they are righteous, God dwells in them, and vice versa. It also applies vice versa. Because God dwells in them, they are now righteous. So it's like a two-way street effect here.
Right.
Because they can be righteous without God in the first place. And because they are righteous, God continually dwells with them and actually makes them righteous in the process of dwelling with them and being their refuge. So here we have now these two groups meet, the righteous and then these people, these workers of iniquity. They meet and they are now, what's their response? They're in great fear. So I think David here, I love David because he's unique and he's also like really crafty with his words. And I think this is a great instance of that. I think he is in a stealthy manner calling himself righteous. He's saying that the only thing I can think of why I'm going through all these things is because our two natures are completely contrary. All these workers of iniquity who are fighting against me and my kingdom, my people, eating up my people as they eat bread. The only reason we're fighting and we're like clashing is because we don't have the same nature. Our nature is different. God is in the generation of the righteous. You are all in great fear whenever you see the righteous because you don't know God at all. So whenever you see God and you see a righteous nation, your morally corrupt nature by nature trembles and fears because you don't want to come to a morally right and pure people because God infills them. And so saying that this is the result of this is why I'm I'm having an earthly conflict. It's because it's a spiritual, moral problem actually going on in the midst of all these things happening. And I love then verse number 6, because he actually stops talking about these people in the third person and he addresses them in the second person. He says, "Ye have shamed the counsel of the poor, because the Lord is his refuge." So this "ye" still refers back to the workers of iniquity, and you'll see this all throughout the Psalms. Whenever David will talk about someone in the third person, and then just goes to directly addressing them in the second person, which is, you have that liberty with poetry that you don't really have in prose or in like the epistle writings that Paul does.
Mm-hmm.
That's really cool. So you send the counsel of the poor, because the Lord is his refuge. The Lord is
The
the poor.
poor's.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Good. So so here's another thing. Like, what does the Bible like have in mind whenever it talks about the group, the poor?
Typically, I think of, I think of, the meek will inherit the earth, the poor will
Mm-hmm.
be rich, the how he always, it seems to be like the Lord always, the poor are the Lord's people on this earth that will be rich and bountiful in heaven. That, I don't, that's what's kind of going through my mind at the moment.
That's a good start, I think. Because like I think what David and what Proverbs and a lot of your biblical poetry will do is talk about the poor, and even in Matthew chapter 1 with Mary's song, is they mention this poor um, as a group that is humble. Like you could almost, just synonymously put the word humble for the word poor to make sense. It's this idea not of like someone who is not wealthy, but someone who is almost like downtrodden in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
and is humble to a sense that they know about their broken humanity. They know their brokenness, maybe all too much to kind of like carry on by themselves. So here we have the workers of iniquity who are living in a broken world, or are living in a broken humanity, and are fallen by their flesh, but they don't even know it. We have a group who are the righteous, who have acknowledged their broken humanity and have found their righteousness in God alone. And then we have this group, the poor, who have only got to the point of noticing their broken humanity. They're humble, but I wouldn't call them. I wouldn't put them one on one with the righteous in verse number 5, because I think the biblical authors here is kind of like portraying them as almost like someone who's downcast, waiting for God to pick them back up and to be their refuge. And that's what he talks about here. Whenever he says the Lord is the poor's refuge, he brings up the poor out of his lowly estate to be that righteous people in the Lord's refuge, in his protection, and in his provisions. So what he's saying here is, you evildoers, you are planning against the poor. And I don't like the word because in the KJV. I feel like it's not really a because.
It's not a why.
Yeah, it doesn't function like a why.
Mm-hmm.
It almost functions like a but, like it's a contrast. Like you
Right.
plan against the counsel of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. Like it's like a contrasting thing.
Right.
So I don't like the word but that the KJV uses. Or because the KJV uses, I think it's more like a contrast. And obviously, I wouldn't ask that in a question, like what contrast is recorded.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the workers of iniquity didn't shame the counsel of the poor because the Lord
Right.
is the poor's refuge. That doesn't make any sense. So I do agree that that question should not be written that way, because
I
it's
would, yeah, I wouldn't ask a why or a contrast. I would just leave it alone. I wouldn't even think about that. So yeah.
yes.
So yeah, what it's basically saying is, you've shamed the counsel of the poor, but contrasting nature, contrasting word, the Lord is the poor's refuge. So even though you've, and you're all you can muster up in your carnal, fleshly nature, you come against the poor. The Lord is still going to lift up the poor because they've acknowledged their poor state. They've acknowledged where they're at in their broken humanity to the point where God can now lift them up because of their humility whenever these workers of iniquity are lacking humility altogether because they're in a fleshly state or in a broken state, yet they don't even realize it at all. Mm-hmm. And because of that, they are now fighting against God's own chosen people, which essentially is the kingdom of Israel and David's own kingdom in this historical context. And then I love verse number 7 because it's just a hot topic all across biblical scholarship. And I kind of want to pick your brain about it first.
Oh God, I'm not one.
Oh, that the salvation of Israel were come out of Zion. When the Lord bringeth back the captivity of his people, Jacob shall rejoice, and Israel shall be glad. Wow.
There's a lot. There's a lot in there, for sure.
Yep. That's just, yeah. What's your thoughts on that verse?
It's a great verse.
It sounds really good.
It's a great verse. Well, obviously Jacob and Israel are the same.
Yes.
So it's more of a poetic use. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. The nation of Israel, the nation of Jacob. All pretty much the same, and which is something that David tends to do here and there throughout our study this year. I feel like you have a lot to say about this verse.
I actually don't
Really.
This was one of the verses in Psalms where I'm kind of just still trying to chew on because it's just I don't know what David has in mind whenever he's I see the connection, obviously the connection of the poor in verse number 6, and then the captive people in verse number 7, or the Lord bringing out this people from their captivity. It's these states of bondage and the Lord lifting up this people out of bondage to not to be to be in a state of fortified protection. But I'm not really sure. Like you mentioned, the name change. Why go from Jacob and then Israel? There's a lot of I kind of like this view, even though I'm not really 100% sure it's right. Because David obviously is rendered as a prophet in a lot of different ways. Whenever he talks about himself in a lot of the Psalms, a lot of those Psalms or those sentiments of emotion then come back in the Gospels as being attributed to Jesus. So whenever David quotes in one of the Psalms, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Mm-hmm. And Christ now quotes on the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? That has a double meaning because it meant something to David, but it also has now been prophetically fulfilled in the words of Jesus Christ now in the Gospels. And so I kind of take this liberty whenever I read instances of that obviously Jacob and Israel are God's chosen people. The kingdom of Israel, Jacob was before wrestled with the angel. His name was changed to Israel, whatever. But I think a possible interpretation of this, and it's a very, very broad interpretation, is that Jacob is referring to the Old Testament people of God being the nation of Israel. And then the Israel actually is referring to the new covenant, the New Testament people of God, which is every tribe, every nation, every people out of every kindred being redeemed by the Lamb. And so that's one interpretation that I've kind of come to like. I think it's really a broad interpretation and maybe not even accurate, but basically what that could be saying is that there was a time of Hebrew captivity all across the Old Testament with the Persians, and then the Persians let the people go with the rule of Cyrus, and then Babylon and all that. So that definitely has a historical meaning, but it also has a broader sense of spiritual captivity that we see in the New Testament with the Gentiles actually now coming to salvation in Acts chapter 10, and then onward in the New Testament to actually now being liberated and being saved by Jesus Christ in the New Testament and his work on the cross and salvation in Acts chapter 2, verse 38. So this is really hard. I'm kind of stumped on Psalms chapter 14, verse 7, because we get this imagery of like the salvation of Israel coming out of Zion. That's obviously Zion. We can talk about Zion for a second. Zion essentially is just Jerusalem. This image of Zion is the basically Jerusalem set upon a huge hill in the Middle East, and Zion has been like come to basically have this poetic symbolism of like this is God's hill. We're going up. There's a lot of I could talk about like the going up to meet the Lord, that whole entire motif all across the Old Testament. But what it's saying basically is that whenever you went to worship in the Old Testament, you always had to go up to the mountain, up to Mount Zion to go worship the Lord. And it was this idea that whenever you met the Lord on top of the hill or mountain, that was a space that the heavens would then come down and then the earth would then go up. And then you would meet God in this kind of mixture of heaven and earth and actually communicate with God. So that's this idea here is that whenever we come up basically from our lowly fleshly estate to actually then meet the Lord and his salvation then comes down, we see this mixture of the Lord being exalting people that were poor, according to verse number 6, and then his captive people in verse number 7, that he actually is able to then take our fallen humanity that everyone has, the atheists, the workers of iniquity, the children of men, all across the board, all of their iniquity, he's then able to then transmit his righteousness from Zion, from his Mount Zion, to now a people who is full of filth, who is full of just dirtiness, dirty rags. He's then able to basically impute that righteousness to his lowly people and make them fully whole, fully righteous, to basically overcome captivity, whether that mean in the historical sense, but also in just the spiritual sense that we'll come to see in the New Testament. Whenever I love this image in Revelation, whenever there's this image that John sees a bloody lamb just walking across the entire world, and all of creation, every person who is saved, out of every kindred, tongue, tribe, nation, people, all following the Lamb of God, crucified from the foundation of the world, to basically now inherit the new creation. So that's a very, very broad interpretation of Psalms chapter 14, verse 7, but I like it. I feel like it fits. Like this whole idea of the Lord bringing back the captivity of his people, not just David's Jerusalem kingdom in this one scene in the Old Testament, but also prophetically speaking, the Lord bringing back the captivity of his people in the Old Testament and New Testament that we'll see later on in the book of Acts, and to this day, the Gentile church being one with God as his Old Testament covenant people, the Hebrews.
That's beautiful. Wow.
So,
Yeah, I never saw it that way. I love the thought of Jacob being referring to the Old Testament and the and then Israel being more of the current church, right?
yeah, and like Israel, I think like, and I don't want to like get into the trap that Israel is just Gentiles, because I think that's not God would never want not never was like, okay, Jews now Gentiles. It was always everyone.
Right.
That was God's vision, was that everyone would come to him. And even like whenever he called the old patriarch Abraham and he said, because of this, all nations shall be blessed after you. He wasn't talking about all nations in this region. He was talking about literal all
All
nations.
nations.
And it took a simple act of bringing down this sheet out of heaven to Peter in a dream in Acts chapter 10 of all these different unclean beasts, and telling Peter to rise, kill, and eat, and to then go and convert the house of Cornelius to actually do that. And so I think you get little snippets all across the Old Testament of foreshadowing. This is what God wants to do. And it's just, it takes that one special person to get over their pride and to get over this is how tradition says we have to do it, and actually go full force and to follow the kingdom of God and what his will is for that hour, and to actually seize it and take hold of it.
Wow. Eric, I love the way your mind works, and I love the way that you speak about the word and dive into it and help help us learn more. You teach me so every time we do this, I enjoy it so much, and I really learn a lot. So I
Oh,
really
good.
hope that that others are too, and I'm sure that they will. So thank you for all of this. I can tell that this has to be one of your favorite things to do. Is just dive in and talk about
And
the
I would
word,
say
right?
like, don't ever be afraid like to ask questions or to like dig and to just dive more, because I went into this study thinking I hate poetry, I hate like everything poetry, and now I like love the Psalms, and I'm like I love poetry. So always keep an open mind, and just ask questions, do your research, and
Okay,
don't.
okay. Well, here we go. Here we go. So how? What if someone is saying, okay, like I don't even know where to start? What would you say to that person?
I would say there is a whole like smorgasbord of free commentaries online. So like just like you could like literally just search Psalms chapter 14 commentary, and it'll do line by line like the Bible Hub. You can start there, line by line, interpretation like from Matthew Henry. It'll go to Charles Spurgeon. It'll do everything for you. Obviously, Charles Spurgeon's kind of like too emotional for me to be honest, but I'll look at a lot of like different perspectives, and what you're going to realize is not everyone agrees. And that's okay, because I think the Psalms in particular is such a study where there are different layers of meaning, and you can unpack a verse in such a way that is not the same as somebody else.
Right.
Now, do I think that I mean, there obviously are some things where that pronoun is definitely this, it's definitely that. But in terms of like the overarching what David's trying to say, we have a lot of liberty here in the Psalms. I wouldn't always say that for like the epistles or for the gospels, because that's usually pretty set in stone. But for the for the Psalms, there's just a whole entire array of meaning and value out there for you to really try to unpack yourself. So I would definitely say use other versions. I love the Amplified version. I love the NIV. NLT is all right, but I usually use the Amplified and the NIV a lot more. Use those versions. If you still are stuck, look at commentaries. Look at I'm sure Brother Bernard has some things out about the Psalms. He has a great Romans commentary, by the way. But look at commentaries, and then when in doubt, like ask Brother Faubert, ask me, ask Phil. If we don't know, we'll ask Brother Faubert for you if you're that intimidated for the Faubert, because I always ask him questions. So, but don't ever feel stupid, because I'm always learning new things about the Psalms. And I would just say, and I love this comment from the Faubert about the word Selah, meaning to like pause and reflect. This study is meant for you to pause and reflect. So don't just think, okay, I'm going to quote today. It's going to be the same old, same old. Actually, like take time and think, okay, what else is that verse saying that I'm not exactly getting? Because whenever I quoted like Hebrews, there was always something new to get out of every single time I quoted, no matter how many times I quoted that study. And with the Psalms, it's the exact same way. The Psalms are always speaking, they're always urging for you to listen. So I would definitely say have an open ear.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing all this with us. We once again went a good bit on chapter 14. It's awesome that we can just dive so deep into this and talk about it. So I'm excited to keep doing this. Like we said, we probably gonna have a lot more free time in the next coming weeks. So we're gonna get as many of these out as we can. So, and I'm gonna use you as much as you'll let me. So thanks again, everybody, for watching. We hope this helps. Eric, thank you so much, man. You're special. You really are.
What you do for us in the quiz community.
No, well, I appreciate it. All right, have a good one, everybody.